everyone, and welcome back to Lady Scientist Podcast. I'm your host, Jocelyn Pearl, and we have another great interview in store for you all today. I chat with Jessica Polka. She's the executive director of ASAPBio, an organization that's trying to achieve something close to their name. They're trying to get research out ASAP. And we get into the history of this organization and her interest in preprints and the scientific publishing industry, some of its shortcomings, and also some of the progress that has happened in the last few years alone. It's an exciting conversation, and I'm very hopeful for where the space is going from leaders like Jessica. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. And if you enjoy our content, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy this interview. So I'm really excited to get into kind of your bird's eye view of scientific publishing, where the sector is at. There's been a lot that's happened in this space, even in the last year alone. And I think it's an aspect of academia or science that many are feeling the pains of its shortcomings. And what's exciting about this time in our lives is that it seems like many people, yourself included, are making headway on changing things. And you've really been a part of that for many years. So I want to take you back to 2015 when you first met with some folks around the idea for the organization you lead, ASAPBio. And I'm hoping you can tell us how that meeting came about and what were some of the goals of this project and the idea behind it.
Absolutely. So in 2015, I was a postdoc getting engaged in a lot of different efforts to try to improve scientific research culture in different ways. ASAPBio's founder, really, Ron Vale, was a professor at UCSF where I did my graduate work, but I was also working with him through other organizations like ASCB, the American Society for Cell Biology, and Rescuing Biomedical Research. Ron recruited a few of us who are engaged in rescuing biomedical research to help him put together a meeting on preprints. And preprints at that time were very kind of newfangled, if you will, in the life sciences. bioRxiv had just launched in 2013. I had put out a kind of very tentative preprint of a side project. But my postdoc advisor was really supportive and actually on the advisory board of bioRxiv. So I was very much lucky to be in a supportive environment. But at the time, I was really interested in trying to find ways to improve the kind of working conditions or the experience of early career researchers. And coming at this from the angle of thinking about the structure of the biomedical workforce, some of these issues that you've already mentioned about the fact that the publication culture often creates an atmosphere of hyper competition that is also reflected by the way funding is allocated. So I was really, trying to find ways to address this issue, and I had been doing some work with organizations like Future of Research and others to try to identify ways that science could be more productive and more collaborative. So Ron's proposal to focus a meeting on improving the use of preprints, I think is fantastic because it identifies the fact that it's an intervention that helps individual researchers, because every researcher, myself included, I think really feels a strong pressure to get their science out there, to demonstrate their productivity. They want to share their ideas, get feedback, get visibility. And at the same time, preprints have this really incredible systemic benefit of making research more available to more people, of broadening access to research, and of ultimately accelerating the science. And Ron had actually done a small study, which he published about the time to graduation at UCSF, and found that over the past 30 years, students were taking more than a year longer to actually come out with their first author publication. And over the same period of time, the number of figures and I should say figure panels in papers had increased dramatically as well. So it's as if the bar for publication had just been increasing over time. I don't think that one can really determine causality from this association, but I think it's kind of tempting to speculate about how um, the decision to what we publish is not necessarily based on what the scientific community needs. It's more about what is necessary to get a high impact journal publication that will enable someone to advance their career. And so I think yoking the decision to publish to career evaluation by a journal at the single point in time has had some very corrosive effects in on what people publish and when, and allowing researchers to share without worrying about evaluation at that immediate point in time. I think has a huge benefits, like regarding the issues we were just talking about with early career researchers. I think having the ability to share when needed is very liberating, both for individual scientists, and it's also good for the field as a whole.
Yeah, and for a bit of background for our listeners, a preprint tends to refer to a version of a scientific manuscript that's shared on one of these platforms that Jessica mentioned, bioRxiv. Archive is another one, medRxiv, that allows people to view this research before it's been peer reviewed at a journal. And so typically traditionally that process takes quite a bit of time because you submit your paper to the journal, they're going to decide if it should be reviewed, and then it gets sent out to reviewers. They often have to identify 2 to 3 reviewers per paper, and then that process takes time, and then there's a decision as to whether or not it will be published in that journal, with minor revisions, major revisions. And so that process can take quite a bit of time and really push out the time to a point where other people can view the research. So in the case of my own studies in graduate school, there's a paper that still hasn't been published, but we have shared it on bioRxiv now, years later, and it's a finding that could potentially be helpful to other people in the field of Huntington's disease research. So it's so it's so exciting kind of to think back to this point in time in 2015 when you had this meeting, when you were working with people who were kind of recognizing this issue, um and really catalyzing the change. It feels like there was a need to amplify this idea of preprints and sharing it, because it wasn't really being done, even though your advisor was supportive of you putting this paper out as a preprint. I think probably the norm at the time was to not put out research as preprints. Can you talk about the contrast of that period of time to today?
Absolutely. I think that at that time, the volume of preprints being posted per month to bioRxiv, if I'm not mistaken, was in the low hundreds or something like that. It was a very small number relative to what it is today. There's been a huge explosion in the number of people sharing preprints, which, in a sense, I think that having conversations among different community members, among different stakeholders, certainly helped to accelerate that change. But I think that those kind of conversations were happening on social media as well. I think that it was a really interesting time when not everyone had heard of preprints. I think now, especially post COVID, many people are aware at least of what a preprint is. But at that time, it was this kind of weird publishing practice that the physicists were doing. Um, and actually, I mentioned that I was working on preprints not too long after I started working on ASAPBio to a colleague who is more senior. And he mentioned, oh, preprints, those things that the NIH used to send you in cardboard boxes, because apparently in the 1960s, there was a experiment called information exchange groups where NIH was actually photocopying and sharing preprints out as well. And that is a really fascinating piece of history, a great article by Matthew Cobb, I think called The Prehistory of Preprints. But just to say that even though the idea was quite new to many people working in the field at that time, it's kind of amazing how short our memory is. I think a lot of people had this idea that preprints were suitable for physics for X or Y reason. Like, oh, maybe it's because the experimental work is different, or maybe it's because they work in large teams and therefore, there's less of a threat of getting scooped. When in fact, people in our own discipline decades ago had actually adopted this very physically awkward and impractical prior to the digital age practice of sharing results with one another. And actually, there's a lot of traction behind that. And really, it was, in my opinion, only the physical limitations of like shipping large boxes of papers with no index, no search function, and also opposition from journals that shut that down. So, yeah, it's been really great to really wonderful to see how much the community has embraced preprints to the point that now, I believe in 2022, that there was a peak of about 10% of the volume of PubMed being posted on a preprint server in a given month. So that's certainly not as high as what we see in some disciplines in physics. But at the same time, it's a lot of growth in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, it's so impressive, how far we've come in a way as far as our view of preprints, the kind of acceptance of them within our scientific communities. And I think, my opinion is that it's for the betterment of science as a whole and the dissemination of knowledge in general. Um, so to caveat that though, there are still many challenges that we face as scientists with regards to the scientific publishing system. Can you characterize like one to two of the major issues that you see right now with the space that you're hopeful we can work to overcome in let's say the next 5 to 10 years?
Absolutely. I think there's so many different opportunities for change here. I, may not be able to, I think, pick, one or two, but I will say that one particularly exciting area is recent developments over the past year or three on open access. So making publications freely available to anyone who wants to read them. And beyond that, actually enabling their reuse and their archiving and processing and the ability to be interpreted or transformed. So that is an extremely exciting thing that has been facilitated by funder policies in the US and also in Europe with Plan S, and there's been lots of developments, even in Latin America that have really led the way for decades at this point beforehand. But really, I think in the last few years, there's been a lot of progress for those of us, for example, in the US, to see the memo from OSTP, Office of Science Technology Policy last year, on public access to federally funded research. That's a huge development. And this is something that I think continues to be a huge issue, because science can only progress if others are able to read and build off of what has been learned in the past. I think the concerns now are, perhaps shifting to ensure that the mechanisms by which this open access is achieved don't promote inequities in who is able to publish research. So I think a big conversation now is around how the business model of open access. So in a traditional subscription journal model, an author in the life sciences, for example, might have to pay a article processing charge, or a page fee, or a color charge, as they may have been called, to get their paper published. But the majority of the journal's revenue is coming from subscriptions from libraries. In the absence of subscriptions from libraries, some journals are turning to read and publish agreements, where there's a so-called transformative agreement, where the library is supporting their authors in publishing open access, or they're relying on article processing charges, or APCs. And there's been a lot of controversy, as some journals have announced article processing charges of up to like $10,000, I believe, in the case of Nature. So, this raises the question, who is able to publish science now? And I think that there's been mechanisms to try to alleviate some of these concerns by offering waivers, but they're really not sufficient to address this problem. I will say that these costs might seem outrageous, but they have been borne behind the scenes by libraries, really up until this point. And so I think the research community is a bit, in some areas, having a bit of a reckoning with, is this really what it costs to publish? Does this make sense? Et cetera, and all the questions that kind of lead on from that. I think a second issue is also related to equity, which is peer review. And is peer review really kind of working the way that we intend it to? Or is it becoming something, or has it become something that is focused too much on gatekeeping for a particular journal? Is it as constructive as it could be? Is it something that it relies on a small number of people to create a judgment that is really not very reliable? And if you look at like the inter-rater reliability between peer reviewers, it's not very strong. So yeah, I think that there's questions of how to address peer review that really vary quite a bit depending on what you think the most important function of peer review is. Is it to get more people involved? Is it to ensure the quality of the published research, et cetera, et cetera? So yeah, I do think that this issue of cost and access and peer review and how to address it are two big issues that the community is grappling with today.
Yeah, I want to dive a little deeper into both of those topics. So on the open access front, you mentioned this memo from the White House last year, calling for open access of government funded research. I believe by 2025 is when they would like that to happen. Can you give us any insight as to how they plan to enforce that or enact that?
Yeah, I think a lot of the uh, implementation was, I believe, left to the individual federal research agencies. So, they call on the agencies to come up with some sort of plan. And the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, has been the first one of these agencies to put together a public access plan, to my knowledge. But I think that the NIH has also had a long standing experience in making its research accessible. But after its previous policy has been to make it accessible, research that it has funded after 12 months. So 12 months after publication, the manuscripts appear in PubMed Central. So they either get deposited there by the author, or the journal facilitates the deposit of the manuscript in PubMed Central after a 12-month period. So, in that sense, I think the NIH already has a repository where all of this research is going. And it's just a question now, I think, of changing the embargo from 12 months to 0 months, which is exactly what they have proposed to do. So yeah, I think that it's yet unclear exactly how other federal agencies will respond to this. Yeah, I think that the way that the NIH is proposing to do it is something that they may look to in the future.
Yeah, and you mentioned that they recently put out a request for information and hosted, I'm going to call it a listening party, but I'm sure there's a more formal term for it, where they received insight from many stakeholders across the journal spectrum, as well as grad students, postdocs, and you took the time to listen to this. Can you share a few takeaways from that and what you're most hopeful for to come out of that?
Right. So the NIH has put out a request for information on its draft public access plan, which outlines its response to the Nelson memo calling for these federal agencies to make their funded work publicly accessible. And so the NIH, I think, has been really ahead of the game a little bit, because the Nelson memo also relates not only to peer-reviewed publications, but the data that supports them. And already in effect is a plan that the NIH put out, I believe, in 2020 for sharing data. So the public access plan that the NIH has just finished requesting information on relates largely to scholarly publications and how it plans to implement the Nelson memo. So, I think that there's a few items in there about the mechanism by which either authors or journals can upload to PubMed Central. There's a little bit of clarification about like technical things, like when the date of publication is going to be recorded and things like that. But what the NIH was really requesting feedback on was a couple different questions. The first is how to ensure equity, both for researchers publishing their work and also for people reading the work. So, I think that there's a lot of ground being moved forward in making public access, in making things accessible for people to read. But just because something is free to read on the internet doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually accessible to everyone. For example, there are licenses that allow content to be translated into different languages. English is predominantly the language in which much science is published, but that excludes a large number of people in the world from reading and understanding it. So I think that having content being published under open licenses is something that could really enhance the accessibility of content and go beyond just making it free to read, but actually ensure that people can do things like annotate it, download it, rehost it, archive it, translate, all of these things that support the use and dissemination of knowledge. The equity in publishing relates to this issue that we're talking about with article processing charges. Are we now shifting away from a burden to access content to burden in publishing content, or barriers to publishing content? And so ASAPBio, I not only attended the listening session, but also offered some of ASAPBio's own comments on this, which, I think that preprints offer an opportunity to address this question of access, in the sense that they are free to post, they are free to read, they can be posted under open licenses. For that reason, they address the kind of second major question that the NIH put forth, which is how to maintain a awareness of, to track, to stay aware of the costs and maintain reasonable costs in this whole system. I think that the potential burdens on authors of having to pay article processing charges just to get their article out there in public is something that really could affect, in the U.S., researchers who don't have grant funding, and of course this affects researchers across the world, especially in settings where there's in low or middle income countries too. So, preprints as a way to archive a copy of a manuscript, or really as, many people, I think, use preprints just to publish their work without necessarily thinking of it as going onto a journal. For example, there was a really interesting study that came out a few months ago called Preprint Match, which was a algorithm for matching preprints to published papers with better accuracy than some of the other existing mechanisms. And they found that in low and middle income countries, fewer people are taking their preprints and publishing it in a journal afterwards. It's more common to just have a preprint and let the preprint be the preprint. I think there's different interpretations for what this means. But to me, it speaks to the fact that preprints are a way to make research accessible for everyone at very, very low cost in comparison to the entire journal publishing system, at no cost to readers, no cost to authors, and these costs are borne by institutions and funders. So yeah, I think the NIH has an opportunity here. They already recognize preprints as a way to cite research. So preprints can be cited anywhere journal articles are cited in grant applications and reports. And I think viewing them as a lens to fulfill this public access mandate, I think, is also something that could be very important. The Nelson memo specifically talks about peer-reviewed research. And I think it's really exciting that more and more preprints now are actually getting peer-reviewed. They are, as you mentioned, something that doesn't get peer-reviewed before posting. But actually, what that means is just that now the peer review can happen in the open by services like Review Commons, Peer Community In, and the journal eLife has now moved to this model, which is focusing more on review of preprints and less on an accept reject decision.
Yeah, it's something I wanted to ask you about, because that the eLife announcement around publishing reviews and preprints, and correct me if I'm not characterizing this correctly, because my experience with eLife has been as a reviewer, as someone who's submitted there and hasn't necessarily published there, but they're moving towards a kind of more open publishing model where if someone submits their research there, it can go out for review, and even if it's rejected from traditional publication, it will be shared as a preprint. Can you talk about why that was such a explosive announcement within the scientific community? Because it just felt like Twitter went crazy for a little while there after that came out. And as someone who's more on the industry side, it would just be awesome to hear your perspective on that announcement.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's even more radical than publishing reviews of preprints because as far as I know, I think they had been doing that actually for they've made several different experimental decisions and changes over the last few years. But most recently, what they have decided to do, in my understanding, is to completely eliminate accept reject decisions to the journal after peer review. So if your paper gets sent out for review, it will essentially be published on the journal website. And I think they may have some exceptions for special circumstances, but it will be published on the journal website along with the reviews. So it will be an eLife paper. The citation will say, your title, eLife. And when you go there, you will see the reviews, and not only the reviews, but also an editor's summary, which provides a little kind of assessment of the paper. And importantly, using controlled vocabulary describes the kind of the rigor of the findings and also the significance of the findings. So they have this little kind of chart that explains like what the different terms mean, where, ranking from things like and I won't be able to recall the exact terms, but ranking from, findings that are perhaps not very solid to things that are extremely rigorous, and from significance that might be of specialized interest to people in a field to something that is like landmark and very, very important. The author then can decide to respond to the reviews and put up a revised version. And I believe they will also, there's a potential for revision and things like that. But the author makes a decision of when the work gets archived in PubMed Central. So they've kind of taken this journal publishing process and blown it up a little bit, in the sense that previously, if something is published by a journal, it also means that it's endorsed by a journal. And now what they're saying is published in this journal means that it's been evaluated in the journal. And you can't just look at the name of the journal to determine what it means that it's been published there. You have to actually look at these reviews or this editorial summary and understand that they're all the kind of nuances and gradients of this editorial decision. So there is, of course, still a decision as to whether or not to send the paper out for review or not. And part of the criticism that has this model has come under is like, oh well, there's still some gatekeeping here because you're deciding what to send out for a review or not. Well, in the current environment, peer review is a very precious resource where editors, I don't know the statistics at eLife, but at many journals, editors need to send the paper out to a dozen or more, sometimes many more reviewers in order to secure 2 or 3 that you mentioned as being kind of necessary to get this review done. So, from that kind of philosophical standpoint, the decision to send a paper out to review needs to be made in the context of understanding whether people are going to be willing to perform that review. I think that the community has had a really, really strong reaction to this, because to my knowledge, it's the first time a journal that has this like really established reputation does something to upend the system and to really powerfully disrupt the system in a way. So there's been other great experiments. I mean, F1000 Research is this publishing platform where the paper gets posted as soon as you submit to the platform. And in many ways, it's like a preprint. Reviews get added on top of that, and then if the reviewers agree, the paper can get archived in PubMed Central. So I think there's a lot of similarities between these different models, but what really sets us apart is that eLife has functioned so much like a traditional journal up until now. I think a lot of the reaction is this idea that scientists base prestige, reputation, trust in the brand name of the journal. And then when you go and disrupt deliberately, with the intention, as I understand them, of these eLife editors, to like actually break free of the journal title as the indicator of quality, that is, I think, been very, very kind of shocking. I've seen some Twitter polls where, my overall impression is that many people are quite supportive of this, but there's also been vocal critics. I think that when we start to get more and more information from authors as to how this is going to play out, my hope is that, we continue having a nuanced conversation about this, because ultimately I think this is the direction that we need assessment to move in, away from this like simplistic judgment, outsourcing assessment to a journal editor, to, at a single point in time, make a decision about the quality of a paper based on limited information, because that trait has so many, I think, negative consequences for individual researchers. It distorts how people write their papers. It distorts the kind of experiments that people do. So, I would say that moving away from that is a really courageous move on eLife's part, and I think it's a move in the right direction.
Yeah, the way you characterized it really helped fortify for me why this was such a shocking move. I mean, because even the history of eLife alone, like the building up this journal where, at least in my field, people were genuinely, impressed by the research coming out of eLife. It was considered to be a really good publication to go to if you got in there. It was, a good sign on your CV. To take something that, took a lot of time to build up and have that type of reputation and then to kind of turn things on its head, it really is courageous to me that the leaders of this organization were willing to do that and like, you know, make such a statement for the field and shake things up. And I think what's impressive to me about it is that not everybody has that in them, and not every company or organization has that in them. And I would say they're few and far between, right? Like the willingness to change things takes a lot of courage. And I actually want to segue into your own career because you have a really impressive academic career. During your postdoc, you had a Jane Coffin Childs Fellowship, which is one of the most prestigious postdoc fellowships. You were in an HHMI lab. You made some exciting discoveries, but you clearly had a drive to move into the field of changing science as a whole. And I'm curious if you always had that kind of revolutionary spirit. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the decision to move into a leadership position with ASAPBio and what it was like to make that decision.
Yeah, I think it's something that is not something that I expected to do when I set out to go to grad school. In my undergraduate career, I had been engaged in some like student advocacy organizations. And so, I think I've always been drawn to the idea of trying to make some constructive social change. I think I went into grad school with the idea of devoting myself, to science and making that change and making discoveries. And I, remain, very much in love with biology, and I think have had such a wonderful time, like at the bench doing science. Um, but as I move forward in my career, I kind of some experiences accumulated that showed me that perhaps the overall environment that we have created for doing science is not really fit for purpose, in my opinion. I have every single paper that I've been on, or every single paper I've been like a lead author on, first author. I felt like we were under competition. We needed to get a paper out, get it out to avoid being scooped, which, if you step back, wait a minute, aren't we all trying to figure out how biology works? Like, isn't that the point of this, rather than trying to protect some individual priority claim that, for very pragmatic reasons, to maintain the ability to get funding, to secure, fellowships, jobs, whatever. There's a lot of emphasis on competition and being competitive. And I think a big part of that is due to the way that the biomedical research enterprise is structured. It's structured with the majority of academic labor being performed by trainees, where I think there's some notion that they're being trained to do science, and of course a thriving biomedical research enterprise outside of academia. But it does create, I think, this environment in which many people are really struggling and become, I think, a bit career minded or career focused. I think I had this experience where I was during my postdoc getting interested in organizing postdocs together to kind of talk about some of these issues. And as part of that was at a meeting, I believe Faster Cures, which is about accelerating discovery and biomedical cures. And I was in this session and somebody asked a question, which is, how can we support early career researchers because they're the ones who are really making these discoveries to advance human health. And hearing that question was really kind of a wake-up call to me, because actually that same day I'd been dealing with the fact that my paper had been rejected from a journal, and I was going to have to rewrite the paper for this different audience. What I had been thinking about and worrying about was not finding cures that help people, right? It was, how do I get my paper published? Like focused on these kind of proximal goals that aren't necessarily related to the common good. And I felt that I think, this moment, along with many others, really cemented my desire to do something that could be constructive for changing science for the better, changing the culture in which people are doing science for the better. So, from that perspective, I think working on preprints and it is so refreshing, I think, as a researcher, to be like, I'm just putting my paper out there. I can share it. I can send it to anyone. I can, people can reference it. They can cite it if they want. This is, people can talk to me about it. It's very refreshing to get back to this like basic need in science, which is communicating directly to other people. I think that this is something that researchers do at meetings, when they give a poster, they give a talk, when they are in, visiting one another at different institutions. There's a being able to have this kind of direct communication that is decoupled from evaluation and from this concept of judgment and gatekeeping, which is so associated with peer review at journals, was incredibly refreshing. And I felt that if I could, it would be a huge honor to be able to work towards making that available to more people and making that something that is more a part of the norms in biomedical research. I think that taking the decision to actually go work on ASAPBio full time rather than as a side project was something that I think that came with a lot of soul searching, in a sense, because I'd really built up this identity of myself as a researcher. I kind of maintained a visiting appointment during my postdoc for a while. And, I think just felt a little bit hesitant about abandoning this, research, because I do love it. But in the end, it's been amazing. And I feel really, really fortunate to have the opportunity to devote myself to this completely.
Can you share any advice you would have for others who are perhaps in a similar boat, as far as they've been going down this academic track? They have, devoted a lot of time and energy to doing the traditional scientific publishing game, and are perhaps facing this type of decision in their career?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's the question that I think people really need to ask themselves are, partially like, what kind of of impact do you want to have, and is that impact through making this environment, I think, more conducive for other researchers, which I think could potentially, work at a larger scale. Um, do you want to be engaged in the research itself, which is so beautiful and rewarding and wonderful? I think that it's possible to probably do both, but at the same time, um, it's often, um, you know, many people, I think, there's a lot of demands, especially on early career faculty members. I think that it's difficult to devote oneself fully to two full-time jobs, right? Um, so I think that, as far as making the decision, that is something that, probably the only way to understand, for yourself, would probably be to get involved in these projects on the side, to be vocal. At the time that I was a postdoc, Twitter played a huge role in my life, really finding other people that were like-minded to talk to begin having a conversation and having a voice to develop opinions and thoughts and, uh, questions about these issues. Being vocal, I think, talking with other postdocs, but also other people, outside of the kind of your department, I think is really important. Um, for people who are thinking of moving into a space that is more relating to open science, there's a few different options available. For example, eLife has a great early career, outreach program where they have ambassadors. At ASAPBio, we have a fellows program where people can join for about 8 months. We have, kind of a program of educating people about preprints, but also supporting them and doing some work on projects like, crowd review, like, creating resources, as well. So I think that there are, several of these different, opportunities for people to try out, this kind of way of thinking. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that that having these kind of conversations and beginning to do so early, is really great for early career researchers. I think everybody should be engaged, regardless of whether they want to, move away from academia or move into a different direction. In some of the broader implications of science, or in thinking about how science works, it's, I think, so important for whether or not you're staying in academia or not, to really have a critical eye on how academia is working, how the scientific research enterprise is working, and also to have this attitude that you are responsible, you are capable and responsible for making this change. It's not like there's, I think it's very tempting to say, oh, well, NIH should change this policy, or, you know, um, the department or the university should do X or Y. To some extent, there's a lot of potential for movements to rise from the bottom up. And I think preprints are an example of that, where it was from people posting preprints, being vocal about them, talking about them, in those days, like largely on Twitter, but, also in their departments, communicating to editors, and really supporting, the desire that also, I think, came from top down at different funding agencies and journals. So I think the whole preprint movement has demonstrated that, it's possible for fundamental assumptions about the way we do science to change. I think that it's an example of the fact that, in order to make that happen, people need to be vocal, and they need to talk to one another and take responsibility that they can be a part of whatever it is they want to see.
I'm glad you mentioned Twitter because it's another aspect of our scientific ecosystem that I've been, enjoying over the years as a way of connecting with people. We actually really, we just had a call with um, a group that runs a publication, well known, journal, that is interested in implementing some AI tools, and that came about just as a result of a Twitter conversation. I notice you also have a Mastodon account. So, as someone who hasn't been on Mastodon yet, and maybe that puts me in some kind of bucket, I'm not sure, but I was wondering if you could talk about what that space has been like, you know, different or similar to Twitter, and just kind of like if you've explored any other online communities to advance, the themes that ASAPBio is pursuing.
It's a great question. I think that I found Mastodon to be much more cozy in the sense that the people drawn to Mastodon, I think, are like myself, sympathetic to this idea that maybe there's something powerful in having an open source tool that is decentralized, that that is free, that enables kind of community ownership of a social network, that functions a little bit more like public infrastructure rather than a money generating advertising tool. um, so I do think that the people who are drawn there, and I've heard a lot of very valid criticism of Mastodon too, that it's confusing. What server are you signing up for? That it's not as polished as Twitter, and for that reason, I found that the my network on Mastodon is a lot smaller than it is on Twitter. I think about a tenth the size, but it is more active. So per follower or whatever, I feel like I'm having more engagements, more conversations, etc., which is great. But I recognize that it's a bubble, even more than Twitter is a bubble. And I think it's something that is easy to forget, that not everyone is on Twitter. Not Twitter is not necessarily available in all regions. It's not something that reaches everyone, or that everybody feels that they can participate in for one reason or another. Certainly, Twitter, I think, has become a much more politically charged space. I would say that it's been discourse in general, I think, is becoming much more politicized. But yeah, I think that it's great that there are some alternatives that I think people are moving to. I see a lot of people creating their own newsletters, almost going back to the blogging type ecosystem that existed prior to kind of some of these large social networks. I'm optimistic about Mastodon. I think that there's going to be some, hopefully, a little bit of question as to whether they should be recommending a server for people to join. I think it's a great idea. Anything to kind of help people get on board is a good thing. ASAPBio, we have a Slack channel as well for conversations, but I think Twitter still remains like a very important place for us to be having conversations. And yeah, I think it's really tricky given all of the changes, and um, yeah, I would love to see more movement to Mastodon overall.
Awesome. That really gives me a good perspective, and I think I'll go check out Mastodon soon. Um, well, this has been great. I want to be cognizant of your time, and maybe just wrap up with one more question for researchers out there who are, actively publishing. Where can they go to learn more about equity in research? For instance, the fees you were mentioning as far as the APCs. Is there going to be anything from the NIH or the government side that's going to help researchers navigate that system coming up? And any kind of resources you would point them to learn more about what's happening in the space of scientific publishing as a whole?
That is a great question. I think that in terms of cost transparency, Coalition S has created a tool for monitoring journal um, I think attributes of journals, which I think should be available at this time. Other resources in terms of for people to be aware of and to look into are Spark, which is a North American organization focusing on open access. And I also encourage people to be aware of organizations like Cielo, which is a Latin American organization that has been publishing these free to read and I believe free to also publish in journals for quite some time. And they've had a really, really great success with a kind of implementing a model at scale of that focuses on more community focused publishing. That is something that I would love to see elsewhere in different languages and around the world too.
And I actually have one more question that's more of a nitty gritty technical question for you as someone who has like a bird's eye view of this space of licenses in general. One of the things I've been contemplating is our need to format scientific literature in such a way that we can explore it, using things like large language models, and that's something that's actually challenging to do depending on the license structure of a paper. So even if there's a company that wants to go out and format all of this literature, there will be like a subsect of it that they can't necessarily legally format, like you mentioned with the translation issue. Do you have any ideas as far as how we as a society, as like a global community of humans, could document our body of literature in such a way that we can really like navigate it and put it to full use as far as like achieving more scientific progress?
I love the point that you're making here. I think there's been too much science out there for any human to read for like centuries and centuries, and the issue is only getting more and more significant the more science is put out there, the more data is being crammed into every individual publication. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing to have more information out there, but the question that you're asking, I believe, how can we make the scientific literature accessible to machines is so important for not only being able to make sense of the literature as we move forward, but also I think has such profound implications for actually assessing the novelty, the rigor, the concept of precedence and all these things moving forward. And I certainly have been, really enamored with the idea of making a knowledge graph from all of scientific literature. And it really seems like there's an opportunity now more than ever for this to be within reach. I think that this issue of machine accessibility is something that, there's of course like machine readability, which I feel like is becoming less and less of a concern, with a lot of the literature being locked in PDFs that can be difficult to parse. But ultimately the problem is really about licensing. I think that one thing that is positive is that bioRxiv the licenses all of its content, regardless of the license that authors choose to apply, as being available for text and data mining. And I know that is something that can be very helpful depending on what is considered like fair use in various jurisdictions. I think that there's an opportunity for funders and also infrastructure like preprint servers to actually encourage or require Creative Commons attribution licenses. So, for example, I believe it is the largest monthly volume preprint server, Research Square, has in biomedical sciences, it has a requirement for Creative Commons attributions licenses. And I have not yet heard any problems that have arisen by this. I think that an individual researcher, it's very, I think, consistent with the fact that you've put in so much effort into your paper. When you're presented with a choice of licenses, when you license your preprint, or your paper, I think there's a competing desires. One, to make it as useful as possible to the world, but also maybe a concern that it might be used in a way that you don't like, or a journal doesn't like, or something of that nature. So I think that the NIH has already recommended open licenses in a kind of more soft or informal way, and I think for preprints, and I think it would be really constructive to see more support for Creative Commons attribution licenses at these different levels. That would enable access for people right now, and down the road. I think it would kind of help build this type of future that you're envisioning as well.
Love that. And I think it's great education for folks who might not even pay attention or be aware of the types of licenses that are out there. And um, I think you've given us a chance to explore this space from the unique perspective that you have with ASAPBio and all of the incredible work you've done there and elsewhere. And I'm really appreciative to learn about how far we've come with regards to preprints. And I'm excited by the efforts to crowdsource reviews. So really encourage folks to check out ASAPBio and all of the work they're doing in that regard, because I do think peer review adds something to the process of scientific publication. I'm not someone who thinks that we should throw out peer review or ignore it. And I know for myself and my work, I've benefited from having quality peer reviews, and it's made my work better. And I think it's something we should hopefully uphold and find a way to maintain as the precious resource that you described it as. So I just want to thank you for all the work you've done and taking the time to share your insights with our listeners today. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. It's been fun.
That wraps up my interview with Jessica Polka from ASAPBio. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Lady Scientist Podcast. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to this show and leave us a comment. Let us know what you think about this episode. We love hearing from our listeners. Really appreciate the support. It helps me to keep going. If you enjoyed this episode, I recommend you check out the episode I did with Christine Cucinoda. She's a postdoc at the Fred Hutch. She studies gene regulation, and she gives some of her perspectives on scientific publishing. So I hope you enjoy that episode as well. And thanks so much for listening to Lady Scientist Podcast.